Welcome to Baltic World. I'm Charlene.
I'm Crispin.
This is our week in review. Baltic World is a premier channel where we discuss important issues facing Northern, Central and Eastern Europe. But before we begin, how are you, Crispin?
I'm excellent, thank you, Charlene. I have discovered the rowing machine that exists in our building, which I'm now obsessed with. Like, I normally hate cardio. Like, I hate sweating when I exercise. I like weights. I like, just chilling in my private space. Whereas now I have to force myself to get off that machine. I miss my calling as a young rower. I guess it's part of the Australian water sports culture. So that's been good. Otherwise, I've been really relieved by the Rittenhouse verdict, which we will talk about. And if you are not relieved, it's probably because you've been lied to and haven't actually watched the trial. And that's not your fault. That is the fault of the media.
Yeah.
And otherwise, yeah, life's pretty good. Poker's been pretty good. We've also got our first patrons, which we will get into. How about you?
Yeah, no, life's been good. Weather's warming up. I know I saw a comment earlier this week saying, oh yeah, you guys are going into summer because Northern Hemisphere are all going into winter. Especially with I've been following the news on the Belarus and Poland border crisis that's happening, and they're concerned because they're going into winter and it's getting a lot more dangerous being out there in the forest. But apart from that, no, life is being good. I mean, speaking of like going to the gym and stuff, doing a lot of that, I'm in the opposite. Like, I don't really care too much about like sweating because I'm working hard, But yeah,
I'm just a bit of a cat. I like being, clean, and
yeah.
I'm not like a clean freak or anything like that. Like when I'm camping or whatever, it's fine. But I don't. I don't think it's pleasant. I do like the feeling of washing it off though. When you get the shower afterwards and you're it's like, that's good. But the actual process of it, mind you, the exception is this rowing machine. I can't believe that, because I saw it and I would think it was kind of a gimmick. You see in the gymnasium, you see like, okay, there's all the real stuff, the weights, the treadmill, stuff that people kind of, and I think, that's for people that don't actually really want to exercise. They just want to sort of sit down and chill.
It's
right?
not like an Ab King Pro that does nothing.
Well, that's the thing. It's exactly. So I always thought it was a bit of a joke, and then I'd be a bit embarrassed being on it. But no, it's a really full body. I feel my back is a lot stronger. Like all the muscles in my back feel like, I feel like the motion you go through is really good. It get a lot of strength throughout the body without putting pressure too much on your joints. So no, it's
it
really
is a good functional exercise, and a lot of my other background is gym instructing, and a lot of warm-ups use rowing machines because it uses the full body basically. Yes. So
although I'm one of the kind of old boomers who still use wired headphones, okay, and now that is no longer possible, because on the machine, because what happens is, for those, I'm sure most of you will be aware, you go backwards and forwards on it, and I put the phone down with the headphones on the music, and at some point the seat will run over the cable and break the cable. So I've broken like 3 sets of headphones this week. So I'm finally going to get wireless headphones and reach the 21st century.
Okay, good. I'm proud of you. Like, you're moving on from wired headphones. So, before we get started, you highlighted first about Patreon. Now, in my honesty, I didn't think anybody would subscribe because we're such a small channel. And it has been my pleasure to announce that we have a few Patreons. And I just want to give a shout out. Is that okay?
No, we must give a shout out.
Yeah,
it's not okay. Mandatory.
Mandatory give a shout out.
Yeah, so thank you so much. I think we have 4 patrons now.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. We're thinking, but when we get like 20 plus, we will start doing special videos like once a month for the patrons. And I'm really looking forward to doing that. And we'll find a way to make that work. Very happy and thankful that people want to support this channel. We do have big plans for where we want to take everything. And we will be coming to the Baltic next year and hopefully meet you all.
I'm really appreciative, honestly. It's kind of like when you've been at this for over a year, you're kind of like, are people still watching? Are people engaging? Which has been great. But for people to be like, actually, I want to support this channel financially, I feel I don't know. It's just film out of this world kind of thing.
Yes, and I will make the distinction for what Charlene has said is that we've been content creators for more than a year. Of course, Baltic World has only been around since September, and with a highly specialized focus and a clear mission to bring this critically underrated part of the world to a global audience. So if you haven't become patrons yourself and you would like to support the channel, please know that this will all be invested in the channel. We're not making any money out of it at the moment.
No.
And so all the contributions that you do make do go back into creating more content. So
making better videos, better content, and we're just thank you so much. So go give a shout out, and if I ruin your day, I'm so sorry.
Yep, first ever guys. Yep.
Daito Main.
Daito Main, thank you very much.
Thank you. VA, that's all we had as a username.
Yes, now we did have their Gmail because we do get the email addresses that they sign up with, and that did have a name. So if you want to raise your hand in the comments below, we will give you a shout out next week if you want to be named. But we were just using your Patreon display name because we don't have your permission yet.
Yeah, exactly. Edmund Engelman. Thank you.
Thank you. And I remember you giving some really cool comments as well on our channel. So thank you for that.
Yes. Can you say that one?
Okay, so you have to learn this name because it's a very common Lithuanian name. So Vaitutis. And the last name, I'm just guessing, Mikalainis. I hope that's right. Okay, thank you very much, guys. You're the first ever Patreons of Baltic World, and welcome aboard. Hopefully we can give you some value.
Yes, for sure. I did also see a movie, I've forgotten the name of the movie, Red something on Netflix, with Ryan Reynolds. Have you heard of that movie?
Nope.
Red Notice, from Red Notice and The Rock. Okay, so it's on Netflix this week. I watched that. And it was okay. Again, I think you've ruined me being 90s cultured as I was looking for different character development. But there's one female character in there. And for those who know what the movie's about, won't spoil it. But again, no progression. She's hot. She can do everything and anything. She just turns up. The two main characters struggle to go do this, and then she just freaking turns up. It's so easy. I was like, no, and and I told other people it's a great movie, it's so funny, ha ha ha, but it's but there's no development, but a lot of punching. So I mean, whatever.
Not every film needs to be of highbrow quality. Some of them can just be good popcorn films. I saw this film with Mila Jovovich recently. It was a monster hunter film at the cinema. And honestly, there is nothing in that film that makes any sense, and the whole thing is completely ridiculous. But I enjoyed it, right? I was I want to see some monster fights, and there was, and I was satisfied with that because it met my expectations. Where things go wrong is when things are marketed as the second coming, and turn out to be another rule by committee Hollywood virtue signal. If you think of all the elements that needs to be in a modern Hollywood blockbuster in order for it to get funding, one is not offending the Chinese. So if you take that away, well, that opens up new storytelling possibilities. Then there is going to be the whole get woke, go broke kind of thing. So people will start to realize, particularly in an environment where cinemas are not doing very well, where there's a hyper competitive market and streaming services and so forth, that you will end up potentially going, okay, how about we give fans what they actually want? And that will open another element. We see that already with the new Ghostbusters film. I haven't seen it. I've heard it is kind of, it's not a great film. It's kind of one-dimensional in a way. But it writes out the 2016 Ghostbusters thing entirely from canon. Is it that never existed? And it goes back to paying respect to the original film in a way that wouldn't have happened 3 or 4 years ago. And so hopefully, customer choice will win out. It was delayed for a while because Disney sort of took over everything. They bought Fox. Universal Studios isn't a major competitor really. So it was really run by their private political agendas. But as the money drifts elsewhere to other centers of power, then they're going to have to start doing what the market wants. And that's thankfully people still know what's good and bad as a rule.
Yeah. I mean, okay, give and take. Like, I didn't expect much from the movie. So if you look at face value and it's meant to be comedy and action, I guess they fulfilled those two buckets. And if that's what the movie just wants to do, that's it. So yeah, I don't know. They're such big names. I would have thought they're actors picking their movies better. But
well, the next thing that I've gotten slightly excited about is next year, Paramount Plus are releasing, apparently, I saw a teaser trailer for it the other day, a Halo television series, which I know that when The Lord of the Rings first came out, the series had finished. Microsoft wanted to start a Halo television show. And the thing that they did in their sort of press releases, we want someone as committed to the Halo universe as Peter Jackson was for Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And who did they go to? They went to Peter Jackson. They're like, okay, we'll give you 150 million US, which is a lot of money back then, to make a Halo movie to kick us off in this world. And I can't remember exactly the reason why it wasn't made. I think there was some behind the scenes issues. And also, I think Peter Jackson had difficulty trying to make the Master Chief the main character. So for those that are unfamiliar with the Halo franchise, Halo is, of course, a series of computer games released by Microsoft. And there is this Master Chief who's always in a suit of armor, like head to toe. You never see his face in any of the series. And he's called the Master Chief, and he's a so-called Spartan, right? Like a warrior who as a one-man show, goes and blasts away the Covenant and the Flood, right? And they're like, okay, how do we make this main character compelling if he's basically RoboCop, right? Like he's just, thinking the whole time. And I think that was a big factor in why Peter Jackson opted not to do it. He was trying to, because he had a certain standard he wanted to meet.
Yeah.
I think with the 20 years of CGI and computer graphics and things that have happened since then, that is more possible to do. You can develop the character in a different sort of way using graphics that will help humanize that individual. And also the other characters, the AI characters, you can actually really make them come alive as well. So you can make that world real. But I would love to see a show based around, Halo, the Covenant, the Flood, the rings. So as an epic sci-fi Star Wars type film, I hope it's good. And it's also one of those things where you can be relatively quote unquote woke without ruining the story. It might ruin the story, but you are talking about a future age in the stars, racial diversity, all that doesn't really matter because you're gonna, obviously. The thing that I despise is when you shoehorn quote unquote diversity into things that make absolutely no sense. So, for example, the Black Anne Boleyn, in the Henry VIII movie the BBC released, you're like, this is England in the Middle Ages. Right?
Oh, wow. In the Middle Ages.
Henry VIII did not marry a black woman, right? There's nothing wrong with having a black character, even in Tudor England. But when you've got something that is historical and you're doing a historical drama, it really creates a suspension of belief if you're not casting people that make sense for that domain. That is true. I think one show that did it really well was Vikings, right? Like they're Vikings in Scandinavia. So they're all Scandinavians. That makes sense, right? Then they introduced these shield maidens and things like that, which don't have a huge historical basis, but still, by and large, it was faithful to that period. And so that really adds to the immersion and the value. There's nothing wrong with diversity when it makes sense. And I think science fiction is the best domain for wokeism in the sense of and I don't want to use the word woke. Let's just say diversity, because wokeism it sort of implies a virtue signal, which I don't like. But then you have a perfect excuse. All of humanity is working together up in the stars.
Yeah.
Okay, you would expect diversity in that circumstance. Unfortunately, it can be ruinously bad, such as with Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Picard, which I think are the two worst shows ever to disgrace modern television, and also have ruined a franchise that I have loved since my early childhood. So they can be done badly. But still, in terms of just sheer representation, let's say, science fiction is the right domain for that. When you're going into the past, not so much. So Halo, you could get away with that, and that would be perfectly fine.
Never watched Halo. Well,
It's got the best theme song ever.
Okay.
There's a film on YouTube you can go watch where girls wondering what boys do in the bathroom kind of video, right? One of those kind of joke videos. And so these girls, they have their phones, right? And they sneak up in the boys' bathroom, and this is a high school, and they open the door, and there's 50 boys singing the Halo theme.
Okay, moving on.
Can confirm.
So weird. Oh, okay. Well, let's actually move on to what actually happened this week. So, Rittenhouse, that's his last name? Rittenhouse.
Kyle Rittenhouse.
Kyle Rittenhouse. Now, I haven't really been following US politics for very long because I think when Biden took over,
it got very boring.
It got very boring and the news never really covered it. But one thing they did cover was Black Lives Matter. And Kyle Rittenhouse has been found innocent, not charged.
Not guilty.
Not guilty.
Yeah.
Not charged, not guilty.
Charged, but not guilty. Yeah.
Yes, that way, not guilty.
That's what the trial's for.
No, no. Yeah.
No, 100%. Okay, so before I go on in this issue, for those that are aware of the trial and are very upset about the result, you can put the whole thing into two Venn diagrams. People who are upset about the result, people who watch the trial. Okay, they are completely separate circles. And I say this because the people who are upset about it got their information from media sources that wanted to capitalize on portraying this individual as a white supremacist who went out to, gun down innocent demonstrators supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. And because they knew that this would generate clicks and get views because it would, touch all the trigger points. Yeah. And so they misrepresented Mr. Rittenhouse in the worst possible, reprehensible way.
Can we go from the beginning?
Yes.
So this was during it was in
Kenosha, Wisconsin. Yeah.
Wisconsin. And he apparently had to go help out a friend?
Yes.
To look after
a car yard.
Mm-hmm. He had a firearm that wasn't his.
That's right.
So because he was 17 at the time, but he wanted to go protect the car yard. So he goes to Kenosha and...
Okay, so this is during the height of the Black Lives Matter protests in November last year, so a full year ago. At this stage, it wasn't a protest so much as massive rioting and looting and violence. Okay, so Kenosha was on fire. The police cordoned off a 10-block radius area in which there was just utter mayhem. People, setting vehicles on fire, buildings on fire, graffitiing everything, torching everything, smashing everything, smashing up each other. And there was people like Kyle Rittenhouse who were asked to go and look after particular buildings to stop people from rioting and looting. Now he gets there with his friend. He hands over his body armor because he's like, what I'm going to do. He wants to be a nurse. That's his life goal. I don't think he'll ever get that, but he wanted to be a nurse. And so he had a firearm, which he was legally allowed to have. This is one of the many things that are misrepresented. He was legally allowed to have. That charge was struck out by the judge. And he went around Kenosha cleaning up graffiti. There's videos of him for the whole day, cleaning up graffiti, giving medical care to people who've been hurt, providing bandages and whatnot, and putting out fires. He had a fire extinguisher and someone would light a fire.
And he put it out. So wait, so he legally could have the firearm?
He could legally have the firearm, yes. Because the law in Wisconsin is you can't have certain types of firearms under the age of 18, i.e. sawn-off shotguns, small arms, things like that. It needs to be of a certain size, it's visible, which an AR-15 is. It met all of the dimensions, and the prosecution which we'll get into,
Mm-hmm.
agreed with that. So that charge was completely dropped.
Mm-hmm.
But that was, not dropped in the media, of course. The whole thing, like he crossed state lines to be in Kenosha. He lives 20 miles from Kenosha. His father lives in Kenosha. He works in Kenosha. So this was his local neighborhood. Kenosha's in South Wisconsin, and he was in like the far north of Illinois, right across the border. And so he goes through all this process. He's trying to help people out.
Yeah.
And then when the mob of rioters and looters, and they were not legally able to be called anything else in the courtroom because that was precisely what they were doing, were turned on him. He was chased by someone who promised to kill him, and he ran, which he wasn't legally obliged to do, until he was cornered. Then the person that threatened to kill him then charged him and attacked. He's a 17-year-old kid. This is a full-grown man. Now, this man, I won't go into his rap sheet, but he is the worst kind of person in terms of criminality. Mr. Rosenbaum. He charges him, and then when he is less than 4 feet away and Kyle has nowhere else to turn, that's when he fires. He fires for less than a second, okay? The bare minimum, that he needed to do to stop the threat, and the only person that was injured, or in this case killed, was the person that physically attacked him, right? He then puts his hands in the air, yells out that he's going to the police, right? And his hands are in the air, his gun's down here, his hands are in the air. It's like, I'm running to the police, right?
Yeah.
The mob starts chasing him for 2 blocks. A guy runs up to him, hits him in the back of the head with a rock. He stumbles. He keeps running. He then there's a guy who runs up and kicks him in the head, right? He falls to the ground. Another guy who comes running up with a skateboard and tries to whack him in the head. And here he's prone on the ground. He turns his gun and he shoots at him, right? That guy goes down. He gets back up. Another guy runs up to him with a gun pointed at him and gets shot in the arm, right? And lives. And then Kyle, with his hands up, finishes running away to get to the police. That was what happened. All the kinds of clear-cut cases of self-defense that have ever happened.
Yeah.
That's the most blatant, right? It was so obvious that he should never have been charged, that he didn't do anything wrong, but you would never know that if you were watching normal media reports. First of all, that most of them said that the victims were all black, right, demonstrators. So he was a white supremacist gunning down black people standing up for black lives. Well, of all the victims, so-called,
white,
were all white. They were all lifelong criminals, full rap sheets.
What really annoys me is his media didn't tell the world that he was running away. He ran away from people who were trying to abuse him. And he only pointed the gun when he saw an immediate threat to his own life. And that wasn't portrayed in the media. What is your job, media? What is journalism meant to do? Tell the truth?
And I mean, but they, look, to be frank, they only lived up to the standards of the prosecution. So the prosecution in many of these stories, there are not true villains. There are people that are selfish, people who have taken advantage of a situation to portray a particular thing, and the reckoning for the media will come. They will pay an enormous sum for what they've done to this poor boy. But when it comes to true villainy, that honor goes to a man called Binger in the prosecution.
And why is that?
Because he blatantly lied in the prosecution. The reason why it took so long to deliberate was to go through all of the false evidence that this prosecutor portrayed. And so this was corrupt. And I don't say this lightly. So when you're a prosecutor, your goal is not to roast the person on the stand or roast the defendant, right? Your goal is to find the truth and bring justice, okay? So if you're the prosecutor, you're also half the investigator. You want to have all the evidence there, all the facts, and when you bring a case against someone, it's because you think that they are guilty of a crime and you're going to demonstrate that through the weight of evidence to a jury.
Yeah.
the defense lawyers are the ones that are supposed to be the scums of the earth, getting people off and, doing all these kind of lawyer tricks. Well, in this case, the prosecutor just absolutely violated everything. So first of all, he disobeyed openly a whole bunch of rulings that the judge had made prior to the trial. He commented on the fact that Rittenhouse had exercised his right to silence, which is not admissible in court. That is a perfect right. There was a thing that had been struck out. Kyle Rittenhouse had made a comment like a year and a half before about wanting a gun in case there was some kind of like riots or something like that. Like, this was like a completely different context.
Unrelated, yeah.
2 years before, the judge is like, that's not admissible. Now, here's the thing. Not only did it bring this up in direct violation of it, almost caused an immediate mistrial, I think it's fine. If you bring that up, then the defense should be able to bring up the history of the people that he shot. Right?
Yes.
because if you look at what they have done, I think this jury would have made a decision very quickly, right? But that was inadmissible because and that's fair, right? Because it's not actually relevant to the trial. Like, was he exercising his right to self-defense? Even though these were the worst kinds of people, and that any jury, if they'd heard this, like, they wouldn't even got to the end of the trial. Like, we're ready to make a verdict. It's not admissible because it's not relevant to the actions on the night. Okay, and so Binger, in an attempt to prosecute him, really.
And then you told me about the video. So how we all know this information is because there's clear footage of he's running away, and there's drone footage of everyone there.
Yes. So if you want to see what happened, you can look it up online. It's available. What's supposed to happen is that the prosecution submits all evidence before the trial. But they said, look, 5 days into the trial, they said, we want to admit new evidence. We've found a video. And the judge allowed it. They're like, okay, well, this is something the jury should see. Now, any evidence that is introduced to the trial must be provided to the defense for them to review first, to allow them to prepare their witnesses, get their experts to look at it, all of this stuff before it reaches the jury. So the high definition FBI footage was provided to the prosecution. The prosecution was obliged to provide that footage to the defense. What they did was that they provided a lower resolution of that footage, so you couldn't see anything. If you look at what was provided to the defense, it's just crazy, okay? Like, it's a blur. And the defense had no objection to showing it to the jury because they're like, well, you can't see anything, so yeah, sure, whatever. Like, we have nothing to say on it because you can't see what happens, right? They introduced that footage in the high definition to the jury, and that was the first time the defense actually got to see that footage, was when it was shown in court. The judge was put in a very difficult position because at that point,
Wait. So
they lowered the resolution.
The prosecution lowered the resolution, gave that to the defendant. Defendant were like, well, you can't see anything, so yeah, that's good. But then they had the HQ video, which that would provide that to the jury.
100%. That's exactly what happened.
And they were like, what is this video? We have never seen this video, almost. Like,
exactly.
Because it's a night and day. What?
Yes, that's exactly what happened. And the judge, he went off at the prosecution. Like, he sent the jurors out of the room and he lost his because he'd already yelled at the prosecution several times during this trial. The defense immediately filed a motion for mistrial with prejudice, which means that the trial is thrown out and the prosecution can't retry it, meaning that the prosecution did such an egregious offence that the defendant walks. Now, this was
that part of the trial, you mean?
The whole trial.
Oh, the whole trial. Okay.
Yeah, there were several things that happened, including what I said before about introducing things that were totally unacceptable. And the judge was just like, his face was in his hands. He's like, okay, all right, we are where we are. We're going to get to the end of this trial. If the jury returns a guilty verdict, I will have to review this application for a mistrial, with the view that this might actually be a mistrial with prejudice. Now, if you think about what could happen in terms of worst case culturally, imagine there was a guilty verdict from the jury, then the judge throws it all out with prejudice so that he can't be retried. Could you imagine America in flames at that point? They'd be like, oh, Kyle Rittenhouse guilty for killing innocent people, blah blah blah,
But gets off scot-free.
because the judge threw out the trial after the jury had found. I mean, that would have been just beyond the pale, right, in terms of how destructive. But it would have been the right decision. But thankfully, the jury just did their job.
And then I remember you showing me the video of how one of people that attacked Rittenhouse was saying that, okay, so Rittenhouse didn't point a gun at you until you pointed a gun at him. And he was like, yes. And then you see a shot of the prosecutor being like, I've lost. I have lost.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
that is the key to self-defense. You have to match the line of attack with the line of defense, right? Like,
yes. I mean, this is the thing that I was going to say. So there was another thing, and this is where the prosecution should be prosecuted themselves.
I really hope so.
And that's because, and Charlene hasn't heard this, so she'll be reacting live. But when there was an opening statement, the prosecutor said that Kyle Rittenhouse was running down these people and cornering them and shooting them. Rosa Obama something like it's like there were online jokes about this. It's like if you watch the video in reverse, you can clearly see Kyle chasing after like all this kind of.
If you watch the video in reverse,
there's some funny jokes out there. But when you're a prosecutor, what your job is to have an opening statement that says, look, this is what I'm going to argue. This is the evidence you're going to see as a jury, and then tell that narrative such that you conclude this beyond all reasonable doubt.
Sure.
Well, early on in the trial, it was obvious that whole line of logic was totally nonsense. There was at no time did Kyle do anything to chase these people down at all. Completely the opposite. So there was a bait and switch halfway through the trial, which is not allowed.
What's bait and switch?
Where he changed it. He changed a line of attack. He said he's not guilty for chasing these people down.
Oh wow!
He's guilty because of provocation. Huh? So that means that if Kyle Rittenhouse was walking around pointing his gun at people, right, and then someone attacked him and he shot them, he would be guilty for at least second-degree murder because he had instigated a series of events that led to the violence, right? That these people apprehending a serious threat attacked him and then he shot them. You can't say self-defense. So if you go up to someone with a knife and threaten them, and then they get out a baseball bat and attack you, and then you stab them, that's not self-defense. You've actually been the instigator of the violence, if you know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
So see how that works, okay?
I see how that works.
Right. So this is what that he said. Now, there was no footage that showed any of that, but there was a photo that they worked on for 20 hours with quote-unquote AI enhancement, right? Which made it look like he was pointing a gun at... Now, AI enhancement is not admissible, but the way they sold it to the jury, to the court, was that this was a still image and that this was just fixing up the pixels and stuff like that. They weren't actually changing the image.
They changed the image.
So, within half a day of introducing this photo, because there is a photo that maybe looks like he's pointing a gun. Well, the first problem is that his gun's in the wrong hand, right? So Rittenhouse is right-handed. Every single bit of footage, drone footage, start to finish, he's got his gun, he's got it in the ready, it's like this, right? Well, in the photo that is enhanced, he suddenly got his gun in the left hand, and this was introduced as evidence by the prosecution to the jury to say he was pointing his gun at, it was just absurd. And then, and the defense, once they looked at it themselves, had their own experts, they're like, okay, clearly what he has is his shoulders up and his gun's pointed down. That's why his shoulders up, clearly. And the strap is going that way. The only way it's pointed is if he's got his left hand, and it's clear as day. Anyone could see it. It's like, this is a doctored photo. The prosecution introduced a doctored bit of evidence to sway the jury.
Oh my God.
It's just unbelievable. And the reason Binger is doing all this is because he's one of the pathways to political power in the United States is as a successful prosecutor. That's where Kamala Harris became vice president, for example. Uh,
Can this guy go to prison?
I think he should. I think he should. I think he's debased the profession of law.
It's crazy. It's like, this would be like a DS game. Have you ever played Ace Attorney? Like on the DS, and you have to look at the pieces of evidence. It's in the left hand, not the right hand. Like that kind of detail that they've forged. I am so angry. I can't believe, how did he graduate? Like, what the hell? Oh my gosh.
Because he saw that this was a trial for media, not a pursuit of justice.
Not a pursuit of justice or truth. Like, you've just lied. Like, how do you live with yourself? And like, this person was 17 or 18 now, but like, and you're bullying a child essentially, like, for your career. Like, really? Wow. Like, you're a big person. Like, oh my god. So, like, that's crazy. Anyway, so they saw that, and then what had happened to that piece of evidence?
The judge regretted allowing it to be introduced, and it was discussed in closing arguments. I think the jury did work out eventually that this was not an appropriate bit of evidence, and the defense was quite effective in explaining what this photo actually was. But once the judge, because the judge had to make a ruling on whether to allow it, and he regretted that decision. He said, like, when the jury went there, he said, look, I kind of regret allowing that into evidence, because it was applied. Like, the prosecution brings it to the court, say, look, we hadn't introduced this prior to the court hearing. We need your leave to introduce this as evidence. And as a consequence, it was introduced because the judge gave leave. I think the judge was trying also to be extra fair to the prosecution, because he had gone off at them several times for breaching the rules in his rulings, and he wanted to make it look like he wasn't out to get them or to advocate for the defendant. So he probably made a decision that he wouldn't have made normally, and after the fact he's like, this is ugly. So he knew that if the jury returned a guilty verdict, this was going to get messy, because there were so many appealable questions, and the debate over mistrial was already tendered to the court. So thankfully, justice was done. None of that really matters now. He's free, and hopefully he gets restitution for all the wrongs done to him. But if you're at home, if you're upset that Rittenhouse was found not guilty, please note that this is not about Black Lives Matter. This is not about whether or not the justice system favors a particular demographic of people or not. This is purely about the facts of this case. And if you watch the trial, it would be impossible for a reasonable person to find this young boy guilty when he did everything possible. And I say this as someone who, if I was in his shoes, and I say this with some embarrassment and humility, if I was in his shoes, I would not have been able to act with the restraint and respect for human life that he showed. He did everything possible to avoid violence. He did things that he didn't have to do.
Yeah, he didn't have to run away.
Yeah, he had just as much right to be there as anybody else. He did everything possible, and it was only when he was cornered and there was no other possibility, no other option, that he defended himself, and only against the people that were in the hair's breadth of doing him serious harm. So kudos to his presence of mind.
It does really speak to a bigger message of the media and the role of the media in these kind of situations. I don't know. Like, I already didn't trust the media. Now I really don't like the media. I can despise the media. Can they just get lost?
Well, that's why we have Baltic World, a trusted news source that you can absolutely rely on to bring the faithful, balanced viewpoints on major issues affecting Northern, Central, and Eastern Europe.
Good call. Good call. I love how you should diffuse the situation. Okay, maybe we should move on.
Yeah.
All right, from the US, we're going to travel back to our region. And the border crisis is getting heated up. But I kind of want to explore the timeline a bit more of how we got here, right? So let's start off with Belarus and the election which happened.
Yes.
So Lukashenko has been a long-term president. And what happened at that election? So we recently had election last year?
Yes. So Lukashenko is I think like March last year. Um, Lukashenko has been in power since 1994, the longest serving of any leader in Europe. And most people in Belarus can only remember a time when Lukashenko was in charge. Lukashenko refers to himself as Putin's little brother. I don't think that Putin ever refers to him that way. But he sees that Belarus as being an acolyte of the Russian Federation, and his role as leader as being essential to the stability of the country. Now, people can laugh and criticize at that. To be fair to that argument, though, we have seen instances across the Middle East and elsewhere where strongmen have been removed and the consequence has not been democratic peace, but violence and civil war. So we saw that in Egypt, Libya, Syria, like all, the so-called Arab Spring. And then, of course, Ukraine, because when Ukraine went through its sort of colored revolution, so-called, it wanted to join NATO and the West. Now, Russia will not allow that to happen with Belarus. We could be assured of that. They will use extreme military force to prevent that outcome. So when we talk about freeing Belarus, which we all want, we want to have democratic reform, we want Lukashenko to be transitioned out, we have to be mindful that the end game of this is not likely to be Belarus as
being part of the NATO.
Yeah. The Lithuanians would like nothing more than that to be the case, because they sort of see Belarus as their Ruthenian compatriots who suffered under Soviet occupation, who are part of the Great Duchy of Lithuania, because most of modern-day Belarus used to be part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth. So from the perspective of the Lithuanians, they see the Belarusians' place as rightly in the Western sphere, not with the Russians.
But their soul, the Belarusian soul?
Well, that's contested. So I've actually, I won't go into the private discussions, but I've had the privilege of talking to Svietlana Toskanovskaya's advisors, her government in exile, in various meetings. And I've asked them this question. I'm like, look, what's the truth of the Belarusian identity? Are you, Polish, Lithuanian, Commonwealth compatriots, or are you, Orthodox Slavs? And they said, look, you know what? It's funny you ask that question, because some people in the European Union are like, why don't you pledge your support for the European Union and join the European Union? Then we can support you properly, right? Like if you say, look, we aspire to be part of the European Union, well, the European Commission can say, well, we've got these democratic opposition figures that want to support the European Union. Let's give them all the support. But they don't say that. They say, look, we don't know whether we are, primarily Orthodox Slav kind of Russian types, or we're Ruthenian Western compatriots of Lithuania. What we want is to be able to decide that for ourselves. We haven't been able to have that discussion because Lukashenko has dominated all media. But what we need is that debate for ourselves and the right to choose for ourselves. We're not saying we want to join the EU. We're not saying we want a bad relationship with Russia. We're just saying that we want to have self-determination. And that is a perfectly fair and also strategically clever line of reasoning. Now, one thing I would say is that they're both true, right? So on the one hand, I would say that Belarusians are, in their heart of hearts, Orthodox Slavs, okay? But if you watch our History of Lithuania series, you'll know that there was a sizable Orthodox population of Ruthenians who spoke Ruthenian dialect from Belarus, who all through the history of the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth remained loyal to the Commonwealth, even when they were fighting Russia and fellow Orthodox. So even though they might share a religion, that doesn't mean to say nationally they felt, like they were pro-Russian. They could be pro-Western. So this remains to be seen, and is still unfolding as we speak. The Russians are deeply afraid that kind of internal, one of two things could happen. That internal discussion could lead to violence because they might not agree on who they are and what they believe, or even worse from the Russian point of view, they decide to join NATO, and in which case Russia is then completely surrounded. And Russia will not allow that to happen. Now, when
they don't allow that to happen because they'll feel threatened.
Yes, I mean they see the Belarusians as Russians. You know, they like they see Ukraine.
Mm.
They will use military force to prevent their incorporation into a military alliance that was formed to fight against them.
Yeah.
Now, with that in mind, we must remember that whatever outcome we end up with Belarus in the future, and I hope that we end up with peace, stability, democracy. It will not be with Belarus as part of the EU and NATO for the foreseeable future, because I don't think the Western powers will militarily support Belarus in a fight of independence against Russia. And I don't think personally that, let's say, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, let's say they did support Belarus militarily against Russia, that would be an outcome that anyone would tolerate. So I would like to think that this can be done straight through negotiation, that the Belarus can be a bridge between Western Europe and Russia, where it can actually improve relations between Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, because they are dealing with Belarus on a kind of even basis and respecting one another. And maybe that will improve dialogue over time. I'm talking a bit, I know, idealistically here. Like some people will be like, you're
ideal middleman.
But there is potential there. More likely it descends into violence and chaos. And Russia would prefer to have Lukashenko there than that outcome. That's not to say that Lukashenko and Putin get on very well. I mean, Lukashenko, as I said in the video, threatened gas supplies that are running through Belarus to Europe. That is not in Russia's interest. Russia doesn't want Lukashenko to be a loose cannon. They want him to sit there quietly and do whatever Moscow wants. And also, Lukashenko is getting to the end of his life, really. He's an older man. And so there will be a transition just by natural forces. And that is something that the Russians have to think about. I mean, if there is a power vacuum, then power will flood to the opposition. They're unified. They've got a clear government in exile. There's a popular support for them. The KGB in Belarus are basically ruled by fear. That's inherently unstable. So there will come a point where there is a reckoning in Belarus, whether Russia wants it or not. And so they should be thinking about a transition for Lukashenko. So, yeah.
Yeah. I just want to pare it back. I think you're deep diving into something. I'm just thinking, to the person that doesn't know about the election that happened last year, it was contested because apparently it wasn't a fair election at all.
Well, look, anyone who's been in power since 1994, right?
Did the opposition lose that bad?
They did not lose. I mean, it was a stolen election, clearly, right? Like, there was no independent observers to the ballot counting. The media was totally controlled. Opposition figures were being barred from running. They were being arrested. This isn't a free and fair election by any standard that we would know in the West. But even so, it's pretty clear that the opposition would have done a lot better than the results indicated. So there was obviously some kind of corruption there.
And then that happened, and then there was a bunch of sanctions put on Belarus, and places like Lithuania spoke up about having free and fair elections. And they, who's the opposition leader?
Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Her husband had been arrested by Lukashenko. Has been in prison. And so she's kind of become the main figure now.
Yes, and then she left because she had to.
She's in Lithuania.
Yes, she's in Lithuania as well. So then there's that. So then Belarus is kind of annoyed, well, Lukashenko's annoyed that all these sanctions are on their country, and then that's kind of what motivated him to start this refugee crisis. I have a lot of time for Dr. Lorenz, a Polish analyst at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, and he put Lukashenko's motive down to three main issues. One, sanctions relief. Two, the recognition of him and his regime, Lukashenko. And three, taking revenge on those that are harboring the opposition. If we talk about this in turn, well, and I go into this depth in the video, so if you've seen it, this is a bit of a repeat. But
Erdogan of Turkey last year had 3.6 million refugees that he threatened to flood Europe with. This was during the Greek migrant crisis. He says, I want money to keep them here, and we can house them here in Turkey, but you have to pay me.
Yeah.
So they paid him 6 billion euros for that privilege. Now, Erdogan has managed to get rid of these people anyway by sending them to Belarus to be placed on the border. So he's taken the money from Europe. Now he's trying to flood Europe with these migrants anyway, but just via Belarus. And the Russians, via Foreign Minister Lavrov, have come out and said, why don't you pay off Lukashenko as well? And so the Europeans, who have already paid off Erdogan has sent these people to Belarus, and then the Russians have the gall to say, well, you should pay off Belarus.
Oh my gosh.
We should just send those people to Morocco, and then you pay off the Moroccans, and however many countries that can flow people into Europe, you can pay off for the same people. It's amazing.
It makes me feel sick that you're using these people as pawns, like, and they've recycled them too. Like, if it's from
yeah,
like
yeah, it's a recycled crisis. It's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And so the Europeans have to stand firm with Poland and Lithuania and Latvia on this.
And I heard stories of like Belarus, like governments like just supplying them with like the things to break the fence and everything.
Yeah, there are all these reports. I mean, I suspect one of two things are going to happen. Either Lukashenko will realize that he's not succeeding in flooding Europe with these migrants, and we'll take these people and send them back or house them elsewhere, or the humanitarian crisis will deepen because we're heading into winter now in the Baltic. It's a very unforgiving climate at that time of year. We've already seen some human tragedies, which I outlined in the video, and this will get much worse. So this is a real test of resolve for the EU, because they're not like Australia, for example, is a very strict country on immigration and that sort of stuff. So like people, we're not going to open up the borders because people are stuck somewhere. We just won't. But that's not true for Europe. Europe is much more sympathetic to these issues, and the Poles and the Lithuanians and Latvians are trying to secure their territorial integrity. And as the humanitarian crisis deepens, that resolve will begin to fracture, no doubt. Like as we see images of people suffering, that will turn people's stomach. And people have to remember that it's Lukashenko who's doing this. It's not people protecting their own countries. It's the Lukashenko regime who's dumping these people on the border with no help and no support.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
Yeah. Can you imagine that? Like, can you imagine Lukashenko, his regime, like enticing these people from their home country? Yes, they're suffering and they're looking for a better life, and be like, you can have a better life. I know how you could get there. Giving them false hope, false promises, dumping on the border, thousands of people, and being like, go forth. Like, they're suffering. They're absolutely suffering. And this is, I guess, another role for the media. What I'm seeing in the media who covered this is very interesting. Some angles cover the way that, you've spoken about, but others are really picking their cases of, the children, the mothers, pregnant women, like all these tragedies that happened, but they don't understand the context of which it's happening. They're in the report, the individuals. And yes, it is a humanitarian crisis. Do we always have to treat the symptoms, or what's the cause of that humanitarian crisis?
I mean, that's how the media lies. We've already talking about that today. The vast majority, overwhelming majority of migrants on the border are young men. And we've seen the tragedies that have happened with the young men that have entered Europe already. There is nothing wrong with refugees. Like if you go to a refugee camp, somewhere in the world, they've been processed through the UNHCR. You can get an entire family, husband, wife, kids. Yeah. You take them, you settle them. That's good. There's a good international citizen. But flying people in by the plane load, who are primarily economic migrants, seeking to enter Europe and Germany in particular, is...
Yeah, with no background checks. You don't know what their actual intentions are. Like, they could be quite well off. You don't know, right?
They could be quite well off, and they could be violent.
And they could be violent. Like, you really have to think of worst case scenario.
If we go back to what Lukashenko wants, well, there's also the recognition. So he's had phone calls with Angela Merkel. That is a highly contested subject in Europe, whether that should have happened or not.
What do you mean? Why?
Well, because there is a sort of consensus among the European leaders that they won't deal with Lukashenko. They don't recognize him as president. They think that he's leading an illegitimate government, that he stole the elections, that he is a brutal dictator, inconsistent with European values and ideals.
So they don't communicate.
They don't communicate. No Western leader has spoken to Lukashenko since the stolen election last year. He hasn't been invited to any leaders' meetings or anything like that. He's been completely frozen out of the diplomatic space.
Oh, he's like a black sheep, hey?
Yes, and the flooding of the migrants forces Europe to contend with him. Right? It shows that he can act as a spoiler. We see that with North Korea as well. People ignore North Korea until they set off a missile somewhere or detonate a bomb. Then they have to deal with North Korea. Okay. Same with Lukashenko. If he's not being acknowledged, then he will show that he has the ability to undermine the interests of the European Union and that his personal power is such of that of a sovereign. He controls territory. He is the leader of a country, and they have to deal with him. And so Angela Merkel's phone call, I think there are two of them now, acknowledges that de facto reality, that he is the leader of the country and Western European leaders have to deal with him.
Yeah.
I don't see this as a massive diplomatic issue myself. I'm like, okay, look, they're just realities. I'm not like a protocol over substance kind of guy. I think, look, let's just be pragmatic. Yes, he is the leader of Belarus. He's not the legitimate leader, but he is the leader. Yeah. And he needs to be acknowledged as the person you have to deal with when you're dealing with issues related to Belarus. I personally don't have a problem with Angela Merkel calling him, but many people see this as an unfair concession, that he's basically extorted this out of Western Europe, which he has, but you know, it's a fairly trivial thing, really. He's had a couple of
how many fuels
and like if it adds any benefit, it's worth it. And Angela Merkel's leaving anyway. And from what I heard of the readouts, she didn't call him president or anything like that, just Mr. Lukashenko. So I don't have a problem with it, but a lot of people do. A lot of people see this as, you know, giving in to this pressure from Lukashenko. And then, of course, taking revenge on those that are harboring the opposition. You know, Lithuania has been very active. Poland has been very active in promoting democracy, human rights, rule of law, freedom in Belarus. And Lukashenko hates them for it. So he's wanting to flood with migrants as a kind of a personal act of vengeance.
So I guess like the way forward, what we're going to see now is kind of time, really. So once we get into winter, the border is going to be more secured. Also, what I don't like about the news, right? They don't mention Lithuania. Well, Lithuania had this problem like months ago, and there was no coverage. I'm like, we know that Lithuania were the first to be hit by this.
That's true.
They all talk about Poland. I'm like, Poland is important, but so is Lithuania.
Yeah, I mean, Lithuania was in front of the pack, right? They're the ones that harbored, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and her government. They're the ones that really pushed for sanctions against Belarus. And also, you see this in other ways. As of yesterday, the office from Taiwan has officially opened in Lithuania. So they're the ones that have been like the leading lights. But, you know, Poland has its own fight within the EU. You mentioned about the judiciary and things like that. So this is another, you can kind of group these countries. And so Baltic World as a channel is quite lucky in that the kind of outlook and interests of these countries are generally aligned. I mean, I know, you know, there are issues between Lithuania and Poland and so on, but the broader like thing within the EU, within the wider world, is kind of aligned, and thankfully kind of aligned with my own view as well. So it's good from our parochial channel perspective that these things are happening sort of together.
Yeah. So I do wonder. So way forward, like, is it just time? We just wait to see, like, the EU has made the decision not to fund or not to pay out this Lukashenko, I think. At the moment.
And I think with the securitization of the border, the fact that Poland has shown itself to be serious in pushing people back, that is contested within the European Commission. There is a person who came out who said that they're uncomfortable with the pushback rules. That does go counter to kind of EU tradition and law. However, the Poles are absolutely right. They need to do this because these people are not genuine refugees.
They're manufactured.
It's a manufactured artificial crisis.
Yeah.
So long as there is solidarity around that, then resolve will hold, hopefully. They need to wait this out. They need to recognize it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Sure.
And in doing so, it'll deter this happening in the future. So that's necessary. There's another angle to this that remains to be seen. There has been a mass of arms buildup by the Russians in Yelnya, east of Belarus. The Americans are concerned not so much that they're going to Belarus, but that they might create a land corridor, attempt to create a land corridor between Russia and Crimea, i.e. invade eastern Ukraine.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know how serious that is, but that would be a way that Russia could escalate the crisis. Another issue is whether NATO Article 4 is invoked. So Poland's Prime Minister has been in consultation with Lithuania and Latvia as to whether or not to formally invoke the NATO Charter. If they do that binds the other NATO countries to send support to further securitize the border. I think that would happen if one of two things happened. The level of military kind of exercises between Belarus and Russia increases. So there've already been paratrooper exercises and things like that. If that dramatically scales up, then Poland and Lithuania will apprehend a military threat and they'll invoke Article 4. Or if there is a crisis in Ukraine, they will invoke Article 4. Or if the migrants are provided with more serious weapons. So at the moment, they're using projectiles and bottles and things like that, injuring police. If they suddenly find themselves with guns
firearms.
And are storming across the border, then Lithuania, Poland, Latvia, they'll invoke NATO support.
Yes. I don't want to make a bad joke. I'm like, make sure you capture them running away.
Yes. Okay. Well, we will definitely be covering this story as it unfolds. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's anything else to talk about. Are we good?
Well, we were going to talk about men's health. I just remembered that. We'll do that next week.
Oh yeah, we wanted to recognise International Men's Day.
Yes. Yeah. Charlene sent me an article that I've been having difficulty with, and so we'll discuss that.
I realise how lefty it is. That's why.
Yeah. In other words, not based on facts. That's a teaser for next week. We are burning our way through The Witcher. So we will be doing our first ever Baltic World Book Club video. Probably like 1st of December or something. We'll try and release. We'll do a monthly, and we're setting up timetables for all the content. So at the moment, you get videos from us like as much as we can do it. We're going to try and become more scheduled about when we publish videos and things like that, so that you, the audience, have a greater sense of confidence as to when to race home from work and watch our stuff. And one of the things we'll try and do is have a set day each month for the book club. For those that didn't watch last month, we're doing a book club for basically that region of the world in terms of literature. So Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, Sweden, Belarus, all of that region in terms of their fiction. And we're starting with The Witcher, which is wonderful Polish book. Finding it absolutely fantastic, really enjoying it, looking forward to talking about it. Nearly finished that first book, so yeah.
Okay, great. I think that's all the time we have for today. Any questions, any feedback, please leave them down below. Again, thank you for your support, especially to our new Patreons. Otherwise, stay safe and
ciao for now.